Hello, it's with great pleasure that I give you this talk on the history of pre-implantation genetic testing. It's really been a passion of mine to remember how all of this started. So I wrote this history originally for the two textbooks that I wrote on PGD, and this is chapter 1 of those textbooks, and it was great collecting lots of photographs and stories from people that were written in this chapter. So here I'm just giving you a small summary of that information. So the learning objectives for today's talk are to look at the animal work that happened in the 80s and even before that, to work on the biopsy and to work on the diagnosis. And from the beginning of PGT, I was involved with collecting the world data, which eventually led to the formation of the ESHRE PGD Consortium. So these are the covers of the two books I wrote. The first one I wrote with Joy Delahanty and Alan Handyside, and Joy Delahanty is an expert in cytogenetics. She was working at University College London in the late 80s and was contacted by Alan and Robert Winston to develop cytogenetic tests for PGT. And she was instrumental in developing the fluorescent in situ hybridization procedure that was used for many years to sex embryos and also to look at chromosome abnormalities. And Alan Handyside obviously needs no introduction. When I first started working with Alan, he was expert at embryo biopsy, and I'm sure you know more recently has become instrumental in developing some of the tests that we now use for our genetic analysis. The second edition of the book I wrote on my own. It is rather out of date now, and Alan and I are working on a third edition. We had hoped it would be out this year. Maybe we might be lucky and it might be out in 2020. So let's look at the animal studies and preclinical work that was done before the late 80s when PGD was first applied in humans. Well, it was Seidel, Tarkowski and Robleska who in the 50s and 60s had been the first to try embryo biopsy. And you may well be aware that Bob Edwards had been doing a huge amount on embryology and embryo biopsy before the birth of Louise Brown, and he was always very interested in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And in 1963 him and Gardner did the first ever PGD. They took rabbit blastocysts, they biopsied them, they looked at the sex chromatin, and they replaced the females. So 1968, Bob Edwards and Gardner, the first ever PGD in rabbits. And Steptoe et al. In 1971 did actually try this in humans without success. So don't forget, that's before the birth of Louise Brown in 1978. Slowly moving forward, in 1985, there was a conference at the CIBA Foundation, and they said we need to work on the diagnostic techniques. They realised that the embryo biopsy procedure in various species had been quite successful, but it was the diagnostic techniques that had to be scaled down to just a few cells. In 1985, the same year, Saithki et al. Were the first to report the polymerase chain reaction, the PCR reaction. So for the first time ever, they were able to look at genes and parts of genes using this technique, which amplified the DNA many times so tests could be done. And Penketh and Anne McLaren in 1987 wrote an excellent paper talking about the prospects of prenatal diagnosis during pre-implantation human development. And they said that this procedure would hopefully come into the arena very soon. And Edwards and Holland, a year later, did a review called New Advances in Human Embryology, Implications for Pre-implantation Diagnosis of Genetic Disease. Again, talking about the theoretical aspects of this. Now, this is a photo of my dear friend Leander Wilton from Australia, and Leander is really one of the pioneers of embryo biopsy. Herself, Van Sturtecum and Marilyn Monk Muggleton Harris and Alan Handyside had all been working on the cleavage stage embryo for embryo biopsy. And you can see that this is quite an old photo of Leander with her wonderful hairdo sitting in front of the biopsy machine. And it was Dorcas and Summers who had thought maybe the blastocyst would be the best stage, and Buster had talked about uterine lavage. So he suggested that maybe we didn't need to do IVF, we could let natural fertilization happen in utero in the fallopian tubes, and then we could flush the uterus and take out the embryos and then do the biopsy on those, a technique that he's still working on today. Now, the diagnosis had to be worked out, and this had been done a lot on mouse work, and Marilyn Monk was working in Anne McLaren's lab at that time at University College London, where I work, and they had looked at Lesch-Nyhan disease and looked at gene activity. They'd also looked at beta thalassemia using PCR. Marilyn did this with Kathy Holding. And then Karen Sermon, my dear friend, and Andre van Stertecum in 1991 looked at Tay-Sachs enzyme activity. But the first diagnosis in the human, Marilyn Monk and Kathy Holding had suggested in 1990 doing PCR for the beta globin gene. This is me and Marilyn taken a few years ago. But the first clinical cases in human had used the polymerase chain reaction for simple embryo sexing for patients that were carrying X-linked diseases. So the females would be transferred. And this all started in 1988 to 1989. Here you'll see the two pioneers, Robert Winston and Alan Handyside. And the photo in the middle, you'll see someone, a woman drinking from a cup. This is Eleanor Contongiani, and her PhD was to develop this procedure, and she performed the first diagnosis using PCR for embryo sexing back in 88, 89. And when I joined the Hammersmith, Eleanor was just completing her PhD, and it was wonderful to read her final thesis of this amazing work that she'd done under the supervision of Alan Handyside. Another key player here, you'll see in this photo here, was Mark Hughes from the US. He came to join us at the Hammersmith Hospital in the early 90s, and he looked at doing PCR for cystic fibrosis, and his pioneering work was pivotal in using this technology to do the first single gene diagnosis at the Hammersmith Hospital by PCR. Another key player who's not in these photos is Pierre Ray. Pierre was also doing a PhD on PGD when I was at the Hammersmith, and he again worked with Mark Hughes and Alan Handyside on developing PCR and became a molecular expert. So, as I said, Joy Delahanty was instrumental in looking at the chromosomes, and we realised that using PCR to amplify just a Y fragment was not an ideal technique, because it meant that if the technique failed, it would give the same result as the female. We were looking for no Y signal, which is not the ideal way to do any genetic tests, because a negative result would also be the same as the embryos we would be transferring. So the Hammersmith team were very keen to collaborate with Joy at UCL, and I joined really very near the beginning. This is Joy and I at a conference in New York, and Joy had developed X and Y chromosome probes to use for sexing. And you can see here a very early photo of Darren Griffin. Darren was doing his PhD at the same time as Dagan Wells with Joy Delahanty, and here you can see this very glamorous photo of them pretending to do some work here in the lab. So Joy Delahanty, myself, Darren Griffin, Dagan Wells at UCL we all spent a brilliant time developing this technology for PGD. And in the USA, of course, there were key players in the USA at the same time as the UK groups developing this technology. Yuri Velinsky. Here you'll see, this is a photo I took many years ago, about 13 years ago, of Bob Edwards, Jacques Cohen and Yuri Velinsky. So Yuri was developing polar body biopsy in Chicago, and Jacques Cohen with Santiago Menet was developing cleavage stage biopsy and fish diagnosis as well, at the same time as we were in the USA. So in 1995 were the first reports of pre-implantation genetic screening, or what we now call PGT for aneuploidy, and this really was pioneered by Yuri Velinsky on the polar bodies and Santiago Menet on the cleavage stage biopsy. This is a photo of Yuri Velinsky with myself, Karen Simon and Leander Wilton at a conference in Japan. And you'll see here Jacques in his throne, and just to the side of him is Santiago Menet, who obviously was one of the pioneers and has been instrumental in the global development of PGT. So I, from the beginning, was very interested in the world data and trying to decipher how much this technology was being used and how it was being developed. And we were very lucky that right at the start of this, so in 1994, Alan Handyside and I wrote a paper called The Current Status of Pre-Implantation Diagnosis. And what we did is we contacted all the clinics that were working on PGD at that time, and there weren't very many, and we asked them how many cycles they did and what sort of diagnosis that they were doing. Luckily, they were all very accommodating, and they gave us this information. People really loved this data paper and they wanted to have a follow-up. So 2 years later, in 1996, I published an update of the world figures. Again, very well received, and we had a lot of discussions around 1996 and 1997 about how we could make this a more formal collection of data. It was a lot of work for me on my own to collect, and I was interested in doing other research things at that time. So we had many discussions about how we could collect world data on PGD, and we decided to work with ESHRE and for our consortium to fall under the umbrella of ESHRE. So this was the formation of the ESHRE PGD Consortium, which we did in 1997. This is our first meeting. You can see myself and Karen Simon and Stéphane Verville and also Alan Handyside and Hugh Gerrits here. So the ESHRE PGD Consortium, our aim was to collect data, to write guidelines, to be a place of communication, and to be involved with training and education. And we really have done all of those since we formed in 1997. These are just some of the pictures of the steering committee in more recent years, from 2007 onwards. We met many times and really had an excellent output of productivity around the field of PGD. We had many celebrations for the 20 years of PGD. This is one that we had, and all the main players were at this conference. And during this conference, which we held just after ESHRE in 2010, we also asked patients to come and give talks, and it was really emotional and wonderful to actually hear the patient stories of their reproductive life and how PGD had helped them. Here you can see more of the key players. Anna Vega, here's Leander Wilton with Peter Brody, and this picture on the top, we also have Elena Contagiani, Marilyn Monk, and all of us there. So we've had a really wonderful time over the years I've been working on PGD. We've had many celebrations and made many good friends. Karen Simon never liked me showing the photo at the bottom. We're all at ESHRE celebrating the end of a good day at ESHRE with some wine. Here we've got Alan Thornhill, Leander Wilton, Karen, Gary Harton, Dagan Wells and Steve Fleming, who you've had a few talks of by during this certificate. So these, again, some more photos of some of the key players. Again, Santiago Mané here, and Debbie Taylor, who you will see in the video that Esra made at the end. I'll give you the link at the end of this talk. And in the middle, Stuart Lavery, one of the key players in IVF in the UK. And here we have a photo of Pierre Ray. He's both in the top and the bottom photo. And a very old photo here at the bottom with Alpesh Doshi, Giles Palmer, Pierre Ray, myself, Alan Thornhill, Marilyn Monk and Joop Gerards. So we celebrated 20 years of the Esra PGD Consortium in 2017 with a conference in Brussels. Here you see an updated photo of most of the people that were in the 1997 photo, and the bottom is some of the steering committee, the people that have been involved over the last 20 years. And Esra made a really nice video. It's available on YouTube, and it has most of the key players giving a short talk about the PGT, or PGT Consortium as we now call it, over the years and what the future may hold. So I hope you found that useful, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you.